Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. We have a great guest today, Dr. Gary Habermas. He is a resurrection expert and leading Christian apologist. He's written over 40 books and 100 articles on why the resurrection of Christ is reliable. We talk a little bit about, doubts, dealing with doubts, talking about the historicity of Jesus, him dying and rising from the cross, understanding more about doubts and how to really get your questions answered and how to deal with either factual, emotional, or volitional doubt. Thank you, everyone. Stay tuned. Gary, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking your time to talk to me today.
Glad to be with you. Always enjoy a chance to talk about the gospel message.
Absolutely, amen. First off, I just want to give a quick little introduction to Dr. Gary Habermas. He's a professor at Liberty University. He's written over 40 books and over 100 articles, and he is most known for his minimal facts approach, which is an approach to understand the resurrection of Christ, and is laid the fundamental groundwork for resurrection for Christian apologetics. So, first off, Gary, I want to just start from the beginning and ask you, what is the minimal facts argument and how did you come to it?
Well, first let me define it.
Yes.
Minimal facts is an argument that says, let's take the smallest number of facts that have the following two characteristics. The first characteristic is by far the most important. The second one is secondary. The primary one is I will use no fact that is not multiply evidenced according to critical evidencing methods. I will use the critics' methods. I will never say, in the minimal facts, I will never say the resurrection happened because the Bible said so. But I use the New Testament. And right away, people who don't understand that, they think I'm saying, he just said he wasn't going to use the New Testament, and now he is. Okay, let me explain. I won't use the New Testament to cite something to prove something, but I use anywhere from, I've used as few as 3 or 4, I've used as many as a half dozen minimal facts. It just varies. There's no happy number. But I'll only use facts. Wow.
Bless you.
That was horrible. I will only use facts which are ascertainable or evidenced by critical methods that do not take the Bible. These methods do not take the Bible as the Word of God. But I will employ those facts to kind of say something like this. If the Bible is the Word of God, Jesus was raised from the dead. But if the Bible is not totally the Word of God or totally without error, we still have enough facts to show that the resurrection occurred. That's the latter is the minimal facts. The second rule is not as important, but the second rule says, because I'm only using facts that the critics allow, most critics will agree with me on using these facts. And currently, the last few years, I've been using 6 of them. 6 minimal facts. You want me to give you a list?
Yes.
Okay. And I'll keep it real simple.
Yes.
Real short. Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, his disciples were convinced that they had real experiences, but they were convinced that those experiences were appearances of the risen Jesus. Third, they began talking about it very, very early. Very early. I mean, like, as one atheist New Testament scholar says, immediately afterwards. That's Gert Ludemann. He's passed away now, but the German New Testament critic, he says they started immediately. And then, so that's right off the bat, we've got 4 there, right? We've got crucifixion, experiences, the transformed lives, and the early teaching of the apostles. Then we have the last 2 are the apostles' James, the brother of Jesus, who was an unbeliever, clearly an unbeliever. In fact, the Greek word for his belief is a word that we get something like schizophrenia from. His
I
brother was
didn't
not
know
a
that.
believer in the Greek, in Mark 3, and then, but it's also Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7. So we have multiple sources. And lastly, Paul, who was not only not a Christian, he was an enemy of the church and dragged, as he says, he dragged men, women, and children to prison for their belief. Now, Paul never says, and the New Testament never says, that Paul killed anybody, but he does say that when their trial came up, he testified against them, and his testimony was part of what led to their death. So Paul doesn't kill them, but he testifies against them. So those six, crucifixion, real experiences, early, and well, let me back up. Before early, transformed lives. 4 is early, and then James and Paul. That's 6. Yeah, I get those turned around sometimes. I interchange 3 and 4 sometimes. They happen simultaneously. Disciples being convicted and them preaching immediately. That's 3 and 4.
Out of the facts that you give, which one is the one that you get the most pushback on from people, from skeptics?
Of those 6,
Yeah.
boy, if you mean skeptical scholars, now
Yes.
I'm always and only talking about people with terminal degrees whose major is in an area that's relevant. For example, they've got terminal degrees in theology, New Testament, Greek, world religions, philosophy, history, something there, archaeology that's relevant. I'm not talking about guys that just go off on Jesus for any old reason. But of the scholars, almost nobody questions any of those 6. That's why I call them the minimal facts.
Yep. So my question is, what big misunderstandings do people have about the minimal facts argument? When you lay this argument out, or when other people use it, what's like the biggest misunderstandings people may have?
Well, it's from the non-scholars. The scholars know, if they read my stuff, the scholars know that I'm using their methods to arrive at these facts. They just read. They may not agree with me, but they know I'm using their methods to arrive at these facts. But the non-scholars, the people who they frequently call themselves mythers, who don't believe Jesus ever lived, they make the mistake over and over and over again that I just said a few moments ago. And it's the one that says, what's wrong with this guy? He just says he's not going to use the New Testament, and then he uses the New Testament. It's not that I'm not and am using the New Testament. It's how I use the New Testament. I only cite data from the New Testament that atheist, agnostic, Jewish New Testament scholars, other skeptics, I only use data that they think are good enough to support these facts. The facts I pull out because they're accredited. I do not cite the New Testament just to be citing it.
I see. I see. So my question is, what do you perhaps consider the strongest historical evidences or facts that support the reliability of the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yeah, now that's a different question. In my first, okay, I'm doing 4 major, I've got, of my 50 books, I've got about half of them are on the resurrection. But I've got 4 big ones that have just started coming out last year. And in volume 1, I think the strongest argument for the resurrection is the minimal facts argument. But in volume 1, I also do the resurrection chapters in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I give reasons to argue that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which some scholars think is valueless and some think they're very good. But I use the resurrection chapters and give reasons why those reports should at least be considered there. But I do think that the minimal facts are stronger, and the minimal facts usually use Paul. Paul's the hero of the minimal facts. And for critics, they take Paul higher than they take the Gospels. And the Gospels, you're going to find about as many views as there are critics. But everybody thinks Paul was an eyewitness to a resurrection appearance. They admit that, and they allow, of the 13 books that where the book says it was Paul's book, they take 7 of them. They will let you use the critical scholars. They could be atheist New Testament scholars, but they'll let you use Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and that little book that we don't use too much on the subject, Philemon, just because it doesn't answer these questions.
Right.
So the other 6, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, if you pull it out, they might say, I might not agree with your point, but I don't argue with that source. That source is good. Paul's the author, it's good. And I often say it this way, Paul is the critic's darling. Critics love Paul. They think he's really good. They think, here's what I mean by really good, but not inerrant. They think Paul can make mistakes.
Sure.
Paul may not be right in everything he reports, but he will not lie. He's well trained. He has the equivalent of a PhD in Old Testament. He was a Pharisee, we're told. Paul tells us himself. And so he knows how to study. He knows how to do research. He's straightforward. He wants to evangelize, but he's not going to go. You may think, a critic may think he's wrong, but a critic does not think Paul is lying. They like Paul a lot. So when you ask me about the Gospels, I'll say all of them would prefer I stick with Paul's 7 books. But if we go to the Gospels, obviously I'm only talking about the resurrection chapters for this topic. Matthew 28, Mark 16 up to about verse 8, Luke 24, John 20, John 21, and the first 11 verses of the book of Acts.
So my question is, what early sources, which also could be the New Testament or the Bible or outside of the Bible as well, that you believe that most strongly support the historicity of the resurrection?
Outside of the Bible?
It could be inside the Bible and outside the Bible. You could answer that however you prefer.
Yeah, if it's inside the Bible, the number one answer is going to be the critics accept all 7 books of Paul, but Philemon is not really relevant. So the best source are the first 6: Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians. They're easily the best sources according to the critics. Then in that first volume, I add the resurrection chapters in the Gospels and the first 11 verses of Acts, which is volume 2 of Luke, because I think there's some good reasons, but they're not, these reasons for those chapters don't move them as high with the critics. They never get as high as Paul. They like Paul. Okay, outside of those, you could cite people like Josephus, great source. 3 early Christian writers. Clement wrote about the same time John did. And Clement of Rome, this is not Clement of Alexandria, the better known one, but Clement of Rome may be the same Clement who's mentioned in the book of Philippians. But Clement about 95 AD, Ignatius about 107 AD, and Polycarp about 110 AD. So you've got 3 other Christian leaders, bishops, pastors. You've got 3 other non-New Testament guys who are writing between 95 and 110. You throw Josephus in there, and you got 4. And another name the skeptics like is Tacitus, the Roman historian who's dated somewhere between 112 and 120 AD. So they'll tell you, critics like John Dominic Crossan will say the best skeptical non-Christian sources for Jesus are Josephus and Tacitus.
I see. And my question is, how can we confirm the ages of these sources? But in other words, how can we confirm that if something is occurring, X amount of years after Jesus died, how can we confirm that that's legitimate?
Yeah, that's really interesting. On the 7 epistles of Paul, the dates are pretty much the same by both skeptical scholars and believing scholars. They put the dates of those 6 books. There'll be little differences here and there, but here's the outsiders. You start with the book of 1 Thessalonians, which is usually said to be the earliest book in the New Testament, and it's dated about 50 AD. Some scholars put it back a couple years to 48. And what's going to be the latest one? Well, whatever it is, it's going to end about 62 to 63 AD, because that's when Paul was believed to be martyred. So whatever date you put these epistles, they're going to be between 48 to 50 and about 62 to 63. There's a window there of less than 15 years, and all those epistles fit right in there. On the Gospels, there's more of a range of dates, but I would say typical dates would be putting Mark at 65 to 75 AD, putting Matthew about 80, 85, putting Luke about 85, putting John, both evangelicals, conservatives, and skeptics, put John about 95 AD.
So, Gary, I love that. And my question, just to follow up to that question is, why are such early datings is significant in trusting or doubting the resurrection? What do the datings have to do with me or anyone watching this trusting or doubting the resurrection?
Well, the first reason I've given so far is if Paul wrote it, and it's from those 7 books, mostly the 6, but if it's from those 7 books, that is according to critics, that is the best sources. And Gospels, they will pick and choose which ones they take from the Gospels. Different scholars take different amounts. Some scholars some critics accept a fair amount from the gospel resurrection. We're talking about the gospel resurrection accounts. It's the last chapter of every gospel except John, which is 2, 20 and 21. Then the first 11 verses next. There'll be a varying amount. Everybody's unanimous on Paul. However, there is a source that's may even be stronger than Paul, and it definitely predates Paul. And this is the source called the creedal traditions. The creedal traditions, here's what they are. In the early church, nobody could go around and witness a year or 2 or 5 years after the crucifixion and say, hey, check out my epistle, it's right here. There were no epistles. Well, hey, they could say, look at the Old Testament, but they can't say, look at the New Testament, because there's no New Testament. So what did they do? The apostles started preaching immediately, according to Garrett Ludeman, the atheist. And when they started preaching, they're apostles. So when they talked, they repeated certain themes over and over, and the apostles and the people tended to memorize these themes. They're kind of short. As a rule, a long one is rare, but they're usually short, like 1 to 3 verses. And these early, what are called creedal traditions, they're the spoken words that go back to the time of the apostles. They were memorized, and when people started speaking, they started with these apostles' testimony. I'll give you an example. John 3:16 is probably the best known verse in the New Testament.
Right. Yeah.
But very close to it is Romans 10:9. Romans 10:9, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that he's been raised from the dead, you will be saved. Okay, that's only one verse. That's an early creed. That's from this early period. The best known one is 1 Corinthians 15 with the list of resurrection appearances in verses 3 through 7. That's the best known early creed. The Jesus Seminar, who are not conservative. They're the guys who reject 91% of the so-called red letter words of Jesus. They reject 91%. That's pretty critical.
Yeah.
And yet, they think that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following creed, either the creed or what makes up the creed, the facts that make up the creed, they put that, get this, it's really something, they put it prior to Paul's conversion. So let me do this on a timeline.
Yeah.
The two most popular years for Jesus' crucifixion are 30 and 33. Let's just use 30 only because it's the majority year. So Jesus is crucified in 30. Everybody dates Paul's conversion at +2 or +3. So if Jesus is crucified in 30, Paul becomes a believer at 32 to 33. Mm-hmm. The Jesus seminar, remember, he becomes a believer on the way to Damascus. The Jesus seminar thinks that the 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 7 creed should be dated between 30 and 32 to 33. That is what I would call, that's just not early, that's early. So these early creedal statements are also very, like Paul, they're virtually unanimously accepted by critical scholars. So the creeds are the earliest, and Paul, they're the two sources that are, I don't know which one's more important. I would say probably the creeds, but the critics aren't going to put either one of them down. And then you got the gospel, last chapter of the Gospels, 2 chapters in John, where the views on it vary according to the scholar. And throughout here, I'm only talking about scholars, except when you asked me that question of where do you get pushback, and I said people who just don't understand that when I say I'm not quoting the New Testament, I'm quoting these early creeds, or I'm quoting facts which critics think you could get it. I'm not quoting the New Testament because it's the New Testament and it's inspired. That's totally foreign to my argument. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about scholars only, again, people in fields close to the New Testament with terminal degrees, if we talk about those guys alone, it makes no difference whether they're believers or unbelievers or in between. They're going to be pretty close on the material, at least in the creeds and Paul. There's going to be widespread agreement on the creeds and Paul.
Is there a way that you suggest kind of engaging with an everyday person if, the topic of religion comes up, topic of specifically Jesus comes up, and they'd say, there's not really any good evidence of Jesus dying and resurrecting. Why should we believe? Is there any, practical way you recommend bringing up this topic? Maybe not to a scholar, but just to like the everyday person, friends, family.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're talking about you may be talking about one of these so-called mythers who think that Jesus doesn't even live. If they say there's no good evidence that he lived, then they probably believe he didn't. Right? Okay. I wrote a book years ago, I think 1995, and it's called The Historical Jesus. I'm not the only one who does this. A number of people do this. But I argue in that book that there's about 12 sources for the life of Jesus, and you take those from a lot of places. I will use the creeds. Again, they're in the New Testament, but they were pre-New Testament. I'll use the creeds. I'll use the ancient historians, like the people I just told you, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Tacitus, Josephus. All of those are appreciated by critics. So I have about 16, 17, 18, depending on how you count them, right. 16, 17, 18 sources for the life of Jesus, and never cite the New Testament except for those creeds. And the creeds were very much pre-New Testament. So that's what I would tell a person who doesn't believe. I'd say, what do you think that Josephus allows this? What do you think that Tacitus allows this? What do you think that Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp allow this? And by the way, a new book just came out, or it either is coming out or it just came out. It's published by Oxford University Press, and it's a book about Josephus. And the author, Oxford University Press, says that that debated paragraph, there's two statements in Josephus's Antiquities that talk about Jesus. The long one that critics think, oh, somebody else made that up. The book from Oxford argues that virtually the entire comment is Josephus's writing. And they will let you use Josephus. Critics will let you. Critics, like I said, Crossan and others, they think you're putting your best foot forward if you cite Josephus, Tacitus. They have no problem with Clement, Ignatius, or Polycarp, the people there, because they're all of those guys are only about 10 years after the Gospel of John. The three Christians, Josephus is earlier, and Tacitus is just slightly later.
Why do you think it is that we have historical figures such as Alexander the Great, and then their earliest writings are 300 years after the fact of them being alive? People accept Alexander the Great or like Aristotle, for example, but when it comes to Jesus Christ, everyone hits the red light and says, oh no, even though there's way, way, way earlier accounts, less than 100 years, why are people hesitant when it comes to that? Why does that occur, in your opinion?
Well, I can tell from this that you've done your research. And
Thank you.
sure. The earliest source for Alexander, now, I got to be straightforward here. The earliest sources for Alexander, there are eyewitnesses who wrote about him during his life. The problem is their works do not exist. Now, we may find one. There may be one tucked away in a monastery someday where monks recopied even secular books. But right now, we don't have them. The earliest one we have, you said 300 years, you're right. It's about 280. 280 years before 300 is when Alexander is written about in a work that we have. But the best works of Alexander are way later. They're 425 to 450. Now, when you think about 425 to 450, after his death, that's almost a half a millennium after Alexander. Almost a half a millennium.
Right.
In terms of that, New Testament scholars, I just told somebody in an interview yesterday, I don't even use Eusebius, who was a church historian who wrote about 325 AD. Eusebius is just 200 years after Jesus. I'll cite him to just make a comment, but I don't make an argument based on Eusebius. I think he's too late. And I don't make arguments based on I like Clement of Rome, the earlier Clement, but Clement of Alexandria or somebody from those periods, I won't even use them to make arguments. I think 200 AD, which is 170 years after Jesus, it's too late. They're too late. But people, you're right, they don't think about questioning Alexander. Now, that's a secular example. A religious example is Buddha. And we've got 2 or 3 sources we found where the Buddhists say our best sources for Buddha come 5, 6, 7, 800 years after he died.
Right.
So if Alexander is 280 for the first and 425 to 450 for the best, and Buddha is 500 to 800 after his death, I wouldn't come close to using it because I won't use a Christian source for 200 AD. Why would I use something for Buddha at, plus 800?
No, yeah, exactly. It's just interesting how people give so much more leeway to historical figures like we were saying, like Alexander or Aristotle. But when it comes to Jesus, it's kind of like everyone wants to hit the brakes. It's interesting.
I was in a debate a number of years ago with at that time, world famous, best known atheistic philosopher in the world, Antony Flew. And we debated 3 times. We had some respondents to the debate. Critics responded. And one critic, as I recall, said something like this: I don't accept the resurrection of Jesus because if I have to accept the resurrection of Jesus, I have to accept Buddha's miracles. And I go, whoa, time out. I understand you don't believe in the resurrection. That's your right. But you're telling me you don't believe in the resurrection, where the earliest source in 1 Corinthians 15 is judged to be prior to Paul's conversion at plus 2 years. And you say, but that makes me believe in Buddha's miracles, which are 800 years later. This guy apparently doesn't even know that Buddha's things are way later. He's not a Buddha specialist. But he says, if I have to believe in Jesus, I have to believe in Buddha. No, why can't I say Jesus' sources start immediately after the fact, and Buddha's don't start for 500, 600, 700 years? Why can't I say that? But they don't. You're right. They not only, there's two problems. They don't make those distinctions. And secondly, there does seem to be a whole lot more prejudice against Jesus.
Right, right. Yeah. So my question is, in your life, throughout life, you've been engaging with doubters and skeptics. What questions about the resurrection has been the hardest for you to answer? And how do you answer those questions today?
Boy, the questions, the ones that are hardest, are not always the ones about evidence. Because if I'm going to use the minimal facts, virtually all the critical scholars agree with me anyway. But what if I said something? I'll give you some examples. What if I said Jesus made two claims that are utterly unique? And those are, he's the only founder of a major world religion, who referred to himself as deity. Okay, and secondly, he said, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. You know the old story about Peter standing at the pearly gates, and Peter says, why shall I let you in? Why shall I let you in? Why shall I let you in? Okay, the New Testament says it's Jesus who's the gate. Jesus, well, he called himself the door, but Jesus is the gate to the kingdom. Those are two pretty radical claims. I'm deity, and you're not going to get into the kingdom without me. All right. This is a pretty simple argument, but why does the Father raise him from the dead if he's a heretic on those two most important points? Why raise a guy from the dead, which, according to anybody, says that you, God, think his teachings are true, because you wouldn't raise a heretic from the dead? So I'll get questions like this. I'll get questions from the skeptics of this sort. Maybe not on those 6 facts.
Right.
But I'll get questions like this more frequently. Why do you say Jesus is the only way to heaven? Or the skeptic might say, I don't think Jesus claimed to be deity. Why don't you tell me how you know he claimed to be deity? And I do the same thing. I offer a minimal facts argument that Jesus made claims to be deity. But I get those kind of questions. They don't like the quote-unquote prejudice of saying Jesus is the only way to the kingdom. They don't like having to call Jesus deity. Those are two much more common than somebody who would say, oh, I don't think the disciples believed in the resurrection. Like virtually no skeptical scholar in a relevant field, almost none of them will ever say the disciples didn't believe in the resurrection. Bart Ehrman, who's probably the best-known skeptic in North America, one of the best-known ones in the world, He says in one of his books, he said, some, maybe all, of the apostles believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. They had experiences which they thought were risen appearances of Jesus. He said, am I afraid to say that? He said, I reject it, but I'm not afraid to say it because history shows it to be true. History shows it to be true. So I think they're not going to go after the 6 facts.
Gary, what I want to ask, and you definitely please correct me if I'm wrong, from my understanding, what led you to this journey is your own suffering. Your wife, unfortunately, she passed away, and you were in a state of suffering, and you wanted to find out, is this Jesus? Is this person of Jesus? Is he the Lord, or is he just someone claiming to be God? And this is what led you to that rabbit hole. And I think you were teetering on Buddhism and Christianity for about 10 years until you made that decision. Is that correct?
Well, okay, let me do it this way. The gospel facts, the things you believe to get through the kingdom, into the kingdom, are at least these three: the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, the
Right.
Son of God, who died for my sins, who rose bodily from the dead.
Right.
Okay, those three. I think they're central. So if they want to ask me data about those things, that's what we've been talking about, I'll go after it. But it was not always that way in my life. I often say it this way: my doubts were framed at the beginning and at the end by two deaths. And the deaths were the most important people to me in my life. The first one, a few years later, got my doubts started. And the last one, I thankfully had already kind of came to the end of my doubts in about, I don't know, 1990. And my wife, the mother of my four children, died of stomach cancer 5 years later in 1995. So some talk show hosts like yourself, they'll say, I'll bet you came into this because you're a good guy and you just want to help people get through their problems. And I laugh and I say, I wished I could say that. Now I've had thousands of conversations with doubters. So yeah, I want to work with them later, but that's not how it started. It
Right.
started to get through my own doubts. So the resurrection, when I started doubting my faith, and you're right, there was a time after my PhD, I was no young kid. After my PhD, I came pretty close to becoming a Buddhist. Now, not the kind of Buddhist people think, but a scientific kind of Buddhist that a lot of physicists like. And so my doubts were still going on. And again, I wasn't a child. So I was
Sorry to
working with
interrupt you. Just to clarify, what do you mean by scientific Buddhists? That a lot of physicists are like? What do you mean?
there was a movement in the 70s and 80s, that 1970s and 80s, where a number of physicists, they're not trained in New Testament. I would never cite them for the kind of facts. I shouldn't say never, but I basically wouldn't cite them for my New Testament facts because they're not New Testament scholars. But they used to say, I'm a physicist, I've got a PhD in physics, and I think Buddhism is the best metaphysical system to support my physical. Obviously, physics is physical. So Buddha is the religion that best supports my physics. That's what I mean by scientific Buddhism. And some of their arguments impressed me for a while, and I had a hard time shaking it. Now, when I was coming out of it, I made a list of literally about 30 refutations of that view, about 30 different refutations. And to this day, I have no idea why I felt I was getting close to accepting that. To me, it's a silly view. But then I didn't think it was so silly, and I already had a PhD, so I wasn't a kid. So it was my doubts. And when my friends saw me doubting, they came alongside me and they said, hey, you need to study the reliability of the New Testament, or you need to study archaeology, or why don't you study creation? And by that they meant what later became intelligent design and fine tuning. They'll
All
say,
right. Yeah.
why don't you study that stuff? And so on. And I thought that a lot of those were good arguments, but I didn't think any of them were strong enough to hang my eternal life on. So then a guy in one of my books I read one time, he just made a 1 or 2 sentence comment. And he said, if Jesus was raised from the dead, that would show that God put a stamp of approval on Jesus, because if you think about it, God would not raise a heretic, false teacher, false prophet from the dead. So when God raised him, only one of the major religious founders, Buddha wasn't believed to be raised, Muhammad not believed to be raised,
Right.
Any of the major, Confucius not believed to be raised from the dead. Why would Jesus be raised? The only palatable reason, I think, is because Jesus' teachings were true. So I thought that was a great argument, but here's the problem. When I read that argument, I knew nothing about the resurrection. I knew nothing. And that comment, wow, here's an event I can hang my hat on. Here's an event that could tell me if it's true, I have a basis for salvation. And that projected me into the study of the resurrection.
I love that. I love that. Just to talk a little bit, because I know we do talk about doubts, and not all doubts are factual. Some of them are emotional. Do you have maybe one or two practical ways to kind of work through that?
How do I tell? If I'm talking to somebody, you mean?
No, no. If someone is dealing not with factual doubt, but more like a volitional doubt, emotional doubt, because there's different types of doubts as you talk about.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the more emotional side of doubt?
Okay, first of all, I'll just give you some statistics. By far the most common of the three you mentioned, factual or philosophical, emotional, and volitional. And you're right. Again, you did some good research here. Compliment you. Not
I
too many
love your
people.
work.
Well, not too many people mention volitional,
Yeah.
but it's in all my stuff on doubt. By far, the most common is emotional. Emotional doubt in research is maybe as high as 70 to 80% of all doubt. And then the remaining 20 to 30% are kind of split between factual doubters and volitional doubters. Volitional doubters are maybe the most dangerous kind, and I don't mean dangerous to people. I mean
Right.
dangerous in terms of their own faith. And a volitional doubter is often somebody who's angry at God. They keep praying. God doesn't do anything for them. They get ticked, they get ticked, they get ticked, they get angrier and angrier, and pretty soon, let's say they were a Christian for 20 years, they just go, I've had enough, and they walk away. Because they think God let them down, God didn't answer their prayer. That's volitional. By far, most doubters are emotional. Now you ask, all right, what do I do? Well, at the time I was lost because I didn't know what to do, because when I took college classes in psychology, I couldn't stand psychology. Couldn't stand it. But I realized I can't tell somebody how to jettison their faulty emotional views unless I learn more about this. So I went back to the drawing board. I already had a PhD. I went back to the drawing board and I studied under two guys, actually studied under three guys, that psychologists have a tendency to rank their scholars from like 1 to 10. And the guy who was always, during his life, virtually always number one, was a guy named Albert Ellis. He was an atheist psychologist, PhD from Columbia in the Ivy League.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is, and now Ellis died about 2010. But another guy who's still alive, just got an email from him today, David Burns. He's retired as a professor of psychiatry. He's an MD, professor of psychiatry at Stanford. Went back and studied under him. Third one is a guy named Donald Meichenbaum, and I only studied for a few hours with him. But I took 2 study courses with Ellis and Burns. And the reason I studied with them was to learn how, exactly what you ask, how do I teach somebody to get away from their emotions? And the easiest way is Ellis. I'll give you his remedy real fast, although they're both very close. Ellis says, let's use the ABCs. Now, I won't use the technical names, but I'll just use ABC because it works.
Right.
A is what happens to you. And it often puts you in a tizzy. An A might be a car accident. You got robbed. One of the most important people in your life died. And things happen. And then pretty soon, you start saying things to yourself. You say, let's say you're a believer, God must not love me anymore. Because if God loved me, why am I limping from this car accident? Or why did he take, in my case, why did he take the mother of my 4 children? Why did he take them away from me? So they get, their emotions get all worked up. And Ellis says, things happen to you. Accidents, robberies, deaths. But usually, most emotional trauma does not come from things that happen to us. Now, that'll strike a lot of people odd. They go, "Oh, not so. That car accident ruined my life," that kind of thing. And sometimes car accidents do things like that. You can't walk anymore. That's serious. But Ellis goes, most of our emotional upset is not caused by things that happen to us. Those are A's. The B's are divided into good B's and bad B's. Here's bad B's, according to this theory. And Ellis was an atheist. Ellis was a thoroughgoing atheist, did not like Christianity in his early years. He said, but these are bad B's. God let me get in an accident. He must hate my guts. Or obviously he doesn't think I'm a Christian. Or obviously I'm not going to heaven because he wouldn't have let me do that. And by the way, he's still not answering my prayers today. Okay. Ellis goes, those are lousy, those are bad B's. What are good B's? Good B's are this. Those things that just happened, the car accident, the robbery, the death, those things, God did not send them. God did not do them. People are free. Why did the driver that hit you fall asleep? Why did the guy who robbed you want your wealth when he's not willing to work for his, if that's the case?
Right.
And why does a person die? So Ella says, start telling yourself good B's. And the good B's would be like this. Even for Alice is an atheist, but tell yourself good B's. God would not do that to me. People have free will. People use free will to respond. If they make bad choices, we're always going to get bad choices. Someone wrote me from Europe today, just wrote me a letter and said, why is the way to Christianity so narrow? Why does God make it so narrow? And I wrote back to him and I said, it's not so much that God made it so narrow, it's that the people usually don't want anything to do with it. He said, why are there so few people on that path? Because they say no. And then the C is the conclusion. What is your conclusion? And you argue yourself out of the bad B's. So these things happen to you, a disease, whatever. You argue out of them. You say, even with this disease, I can lead a happy life. You make yourself a list on a card or somewhere maybe a some little deal that you keep in your wall all the time, like a business card. And you can write on the back, you can say, just because the A's happened to me, I can still be a happy person. I can still be well-adjusted. I can get married. I can have children. I can believe when I want to believe. God has allowed me to turn my back on him if I want to. God doesn't force anybody into the kingdom. One reason the path is narrow. All right, the C's are your conclusions. So A's happen, B's are what you say about the A's, and the C's are what's true or not true as a response. And you teach them that method. And again, I have to keep saying this. Ellis was not a Christian. He was an atheist. And Burns is a lot easier going than Ellis was, but Burns was an agnostic.
Right.
So these two guys are not close to being Christians, and yet they teach the same thing. Yes, the A happened. B, quit blaming everything on that. Start talking truth to yourself. And C is where we go. What's the final result from here? And the final result is I can be a well-adjusted person in spite of the A's. So I had to go back to school and learn how to deal with the emotions, even though I did not like psychology when I was a college student.
Why didn't you like it? Was it just, what was it about it, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, working in the field of history and philosophy, I thought the philosophers and historians knew how to think a lot better. And psychologists can think, don't get me wrong. Psychologists can think. But historians and philosophers call for evidence. They want evidence for what they believe in. Psychology deals with fields that it's really hard to get hard facts on. Like, why is this person mentally ill? Well, I don't know. It could be this, it could be that, it could be this. See? You guys don't know. Well, and I thought it was kind of mamby-pamby. I thought psychology was okay, but it was a little short on the facts. And I like the facts that historians and philosophers came up with. And psychology to me seemed like it was a hodgepodge, and there were, well, you often hear comments in psychology books like there are 200 different psychologies today. Well, there could be, but I have a major textbook. I taught psychology at the PhD level for years. So you see, I changed. But I got a book up there that I used at the PhD level, and the guy says this method that Ellis and Burns use is called the cognitive method or the cognitive behavioral method. And this book says there may be 200, this is important, the guy says there may be 200 psychological schools of thought, but they all to some extent revolve around or based on cognitive or cognitive behavioral methods. It's the medicine, if you're going to take two medicines to get over your whatever, one has got to be the cognitive or cognitive behavioral method taught by people like Ellis and Burns. So I just thought the psychologists weren't as sure of what they believed, and I wanted somebody who thought a lot more clearly. Now, I don't think what I thought about psychologists is true. Some of my best friends are psychologists, and obviously I practice it when I try to get somebody through their doubts. I want to make something clear. I'm not a psychologist.
Right.
I'm not a counselor. I'm not any kind of professional person in that area. But I will try to step in and help a person going through doubts if I can help them.
Perfect. Well, if it was, I have probably like 40 more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you coming on, and I'd just like to say, you led me out of my agnosticism. Almost about 8 years ago, I was trying to find, a way to life. I didn't just want my life to be these 80, 90, or 70 years I'm on Earth, or however long it is. And I did meet a gentleman named Arthur Osadurian, Apologia Center on YouTube. Shout out to him. He introduced me to your work, and I don't know if you'd remember, I actually got into contact with you almost a decade with you and your assistant, and you guys really helped me understand that
thank you.
Jesus Christ is, he's risen, and he's someone that I could believe in, not just to make myself feel good, not just because, somebody said so, not just because I was born into it with my family, because there's reasons to believe. And I really appreciate the work you did for me and the work you do for many other people around the world.
Well, now you said you became a Christian 8 years ago?
No. I started researching into Christianity about 8 years ago. I became a Christian last year. I was an agnostic for a very long time.
A year ago. Were you ever an atheist, or were you an agnostic that whole time?
I was an agnostic. I grew up in the church. Around 16 years old, I left religion. And then from 16 to 27, for all intensive purposes, I was an agnostic. I believed that Jesus Christ died and rose because you had enough good reason. But I said, you know what? I kind of had like volitional doubt. I'm like, you know what? I still don't want to believe. I'm an agnostic for other reasons. I was still an agnostic, but I think God brought me to my lowest point at 27, and I accepted Christ and Christ's love and everything he did for us. So, yeah, I was an agnostic for 11 years.
Do you think your doubt was primarily factual, volitional, or emotional?
So it was factual. But then the factual side was taken care of. And then they were still factual, but for the most part, it was taken care of through the resurrection. And then it was kind of emotional. And then volitional was kind of like, I didn't really care anymore for a number of years.
There you go.
I just wanted to live my life. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. But then I think really God brought me to my knees and showed me there is a better way through Jesus. Not my way, not my selfish, stupid, and sinful way. There's a better way through Christ. So, yeah.
The reason I asked was toward the end, when you said you're getting angry and stuff, the only one that jumped out at me was it sounded a little bit volitional toward the end, your doubt.
Yeah, it was volitional. Volitional meaning I didn't even care anymore. Is that what you mean by that?
You didn't care?
Yeah, it was volitional. It was anger too. It was kind of like, I'm not going to accept Christ no matter what. I remember telling my friend about 2 years ago, I'm probably never going to accept Christ, but then a year later I accepted Christ, so it could always change.
Well, that friend of mine from Europe, he asked why the road was narrow, and I said because people have their own free will and they don't want to be a part of God, and you
Right.
were there for a while, but it sounds like God had some designs on you, and what should I say? Kind of led you a little bit, but still gave you your own free will,
Absolutely.
and you used it.
Amen. Yeah.
You used it to come to Him. That's a great story.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gary. Where can people find you if they want to get into contact with you before you go?
The two places to find a bunch of things that I've done are either my YouTube site or my website, which is www.garyhabermas.com. Easiest thing in the world. No dots, whistles, capital letters. Gary, Habermas.com. I don't usually give my email address out. People can find it. It's out there. But I usually don't
Perfect.
give it out because I probably spend 60% of every day doing nothing but answering emails. And I work
Wow.
long hours. I work 70 hours a week. And about two-thirds of my day is answering emails. So I don't need any more emails. People asking me what I think about this or think about that. But doubts, if somebody writes to me about doubts, I have two full-time former students, both with PhDs, and they're in a doubt ministry. They work with doubters and they do not charge. Everything's free. And I send my doubters to one of these two guys who are trained with a PhD, know this Ellis and Burns and these methods, and they handle the doubts for me. And again, don't charge, which I think is wonderful. They don't do it to make a living.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much again for all the work you do. We're going to go ahead and link his website down below in his YouTube channel. And yeah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if you would send me the link and a one sentence.
Permission comment of what? Of this interview? Perfect. Yeah, I absolutely will. I definitely will, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much again for coming on, Gary. God bless you, sir. Take care. Bye bye. Bye bye. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this episode. I really appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe. Tell me your favorite part of this interview. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.